The crystalline halls of the Galactic War Academy gleamed with the soft phosphorescence of advanced holographic displays, each one cycling through tactical scenarios that had shaped military doctrine for millennia. In the center of the institution's most prestigious tactical simulation chamber, a three-dimensional battlefield hung suspended in midair, its every detail rendered with perfect precision. Professor Zekethal stood before the assembled cadets, his forearms gesturing with practiced authority as he explained the scenario that had broken the spirits of countless aspiring military officers. The Catherian's chitinous exoskeleton reflected the chamber's ambient light, creating an almost hypnotic pattern as he moved. "Observe Operation Omega," Zekethal announced, his voice carrying the weight of absolute academic authority. "Colony, World Kepler for 38b. Population, 12 million civilian refugees. Defending force, 1 undermanned battalion with obsolete equipment. Attacking force, a full expeditionary army with orbital supremacy and advanced technology." The holographic battlefield zoomed in to show the desperate tactical situation. A small human colony nestled in a valley surrounded by impenetrable mountain ranges, defended by a handful of soldiers with equipment that belonged in a museum. Above them, in orbit, a massive enemy fleet held complete space superiority. "The mathematical analysis is irrefutable," Zekethal continued, calling up streams of data that surrounded the battlefield like a constellation of certainty. Enemy numerical advantage, 50 to 1. Technology differential, 3 generations. Resource availability, defender disadvantage of 92%. Probability of successful defense, 0.3% under optimal conditions. Cadet Veltara of the Ethereal Collective raised one of her translucent appendages. "Professor, if the mathematical certainty is so absolute, why do we study this scenario?" "An excellent question," Zekethal replied, his mandibles clicking with approval. "Operation Omega serves as the ultimate lesson in tactical realism. Some battles cannot be won, regardless of strategy, courage, or innovation. It teaches our future commanders to recognize impossible situations and make the difficult decision to preserve forces for battles that can be won." The assembled cadets nodded in understanding. They represented the finest military minds from across the galaxy, beings whose species had conquered the stars through superior intellect and strategic thinking. The lesson was clear. Rational commanders recognized the impossible and acted accordingly. "Every cadet in this academy has attempted Operation Omega," Zekethal continued. "In the past century, we have recorded 1,847 attempts. The longest any cadet has lasted before inevitable defeat is 17 hours and 34 minutes. The scenario serves as proof that mathematical reality cannot be overcome through wishful thinking or primitive determination." In the back of the chamber, Captain Sarah Phoenix Reyes sat quietly, her weathered face betraying none of the thoughts racing through her mind. At 28, she was older than most of the cadets around her, her military bearing marking her as someone who had seen real combat rather than just simulated battles. The scars on her hands told stories of desperate fights on forgotten worlds, victories snatched from the jaws of impossible odds. Sarah was Earth's first exchange student at the Galactic War Academy, part of a pilot program to integrate human tactical thinking into galactic military doctrine. So far, the experiment had been challenging. Her theoretical scores were abysmal, her understanding of mathematical probability apparently primitive, and her approach to strategic planning utterly alien to her instructors. But she had one quality that her alien classmates lacked. She had never met an impossible situation she wouldn't try to solve. "The scenario will now commence," Zekethal announced. "Cadet Hicks Mara of the Crystalline Hegemony, you will command the defending forces." The tall, angular alien stepped forward, his crystal-like skin refracting the chamber's light into prismatic patterns. Hicks Mara was considered the most promising tactical mind in their class, his mathematical approach to warfare earning praise from every instructor. "Computer, begin Operation Omega simulation," Hicks Mara commanded. The battlefield came alive with movement. Enemy forces descended from orbit in sleek dropships, their numbers overwhelming the tiny defensive force. Hicks Mara's commands were precise and logical, positioning his forces to maximize defensive advantage while minimizing exposure to superior enemy firepower. For 3 hours, he executed a textbook defense. Every decision was mathematically sound, every resource allocation optimal, his forces fought with desperate courage, holding positions that should have fallen in minutes, but mathematics is inexorable. Superior numbers, better equipment, and overwhelming firepower gradually wore down the defenders. By hour 4, the colony's outer perimeter had fallen. By hour 6, enemy forces were advancing through the streets. At 7 hours and 12 minutes, the simulation terminated with the complete destruction of the defending force. Well executed, Zekathal observed. You extended the defense beyond the statistical mean, demonstrating superior tactical application of available resources. However, the fundamental mathematical reality remained unchanged. The battle was unwinnable. Cadet after cadet attempted the scenario. Veltara tried an elegant energy-based defense that lasted for hours. Zixstar of the Techno-Confederacy employed quantum-coordinated tactics that held for 6 hours. At 43 minutes, each attempt was studied, analyzed, and ultimately acknowledged as a variation on inevitable defeat. The lesson, Zekathal concluded after the final attempt, is that rational commanders must recognize mathematical reality. Glory lies not in impossible victories, but in preserving forces for winnable battles. From the back of the chamber, Sarah's voice cut through the academic certainty like a plasma bolt through armor. Plating, Professor, I'd like to attempt the scenario. The chamber fell silent. 24 alien faces turned toward the human cadet, expressions ranging from curiosity to barely concealed disdain. Sarah Reyes had become something of a controversial figure at the Academy. Her unconventional approaches sometimes achieved remarkable results, but more often led to spectacular failures that reinforced alien assumptions about human tactical primitiveness. Captain Reyes, Zekathal's tone carried a note of condescension. While I appreciate your enthusiasm, perhaps you misunderstood the lesson. This scenario has been attempted by the finest tactical minds in the galaxy. Mathematical certainty cannot be overcome through human stubbornness. With respect, Professor, Sarah replied, standing and moving toward the simulation controls. I've never been very good at mathematics. A ripple of laughter passed through the alien cadets. The idea that someone would attempt an impossible scenario, specifically because they didn't understand the mathematics, struck them as quintessentially human, brave, certainly, but also hopelessly naive. Very well, Zekathal sighed. Perhaps a practical demonstration of mathematical reality will prove educational. Computer. Reset operation Omega simulation. Cadet Reyes commanding. Sarah stepped into the command holosphere, her hands moving over controls that materialized around her. The battlefield reformed, showing the desperate tactical situation in all its impossible detail. 12 million civilians, 1 undermanned battalion, overwhelming enemy forces with orbital supremacy, beginning tactical assessment, Sarah announced, her voice taking on the crisp authority of a combat commander. But instead of immediately deploying forces, she began to study the scenario with an intensity that puzzled her observers. She examined the terrain from dozens of angles, analyzed the enemy force composition, and reviewed the available resources with a thoroughness that seemed excessive. For such a straightforward situation, Cadet Reyes, Zekathal observed after 20 minutes of analysis, the enemy will not wait indefinitely for you to accept the mathematical reality. I'm not looking for mathematical reality, Sarah replied without taking her eyes off the displays. I'm looking for something else, such as opportunity. The word hung in the air like a challenge to everything the Academy taught. In a scenario where mathematical analysis showed 0.3% probability of success, what opportunity could possibly exist? Sarah's hands began to move over the tactical controls, issuing orders that made the observing cadets exchange confused glances. Instead of establishing but something else was happening. The enemy forces, programmed to respond to logical defensive strategies, were reacting to her illogical deployments with increasing confusion. Their coordination began to suffer as they encountered defensive positions that made no tactical sense. Interesting, Zekathal murmured. The enemy AI is struggling to respond to tactically irrational behavior. It's not irrational, Sarah corrected, her attention still focused on the unfolding battle. It's just not mathematical. Hour 1 passed. The enemy advance, expected to sweep through the colony in minutes, instead found itself fighting a series of disconnected skirmishes against defenders who seemed to be everywhere and nowhere at once. Sarah's forces weren't trying to hold territory. They were making the enemy work for every meter while inflicting maximum confusion. She's not fighting a defensive battle, Veltara realized. She's fighting a psychological one. Arta saw the enemy forces growing increasingly frustrated. Their overwhelming numerical advantage was being negated by Sarah's refusal to present them with targets they could overwhelm instead of mass defensive positions. They faced scattered units that struck without warning and vanished before retaliation could be organized. The enemy casualty rate is actually increasing, reported Cadet Hicks Mara with disbelief. Despite their overwhelming advantages, Cadet Reyes is achieving a positive exchange ratio. R3 marked the point where mathematical certainty began to crack. The enemy forces, designed to crush conventional defenses through superior firepower, found themselves chasing ghosts through a landscape that had become their enemy. Sarah's defenders weren't just fighting the invaders. They were making the terrain itself work against them. How is she doing this? Demanded Zik Star. The mathematics clearly show this is impossible. Maybe the mathematics are wrong, Sarah replied, her fingers dancing over controls as she orchestrated a defense that should not have worked. Maybe the problem isn't the odds. Maybe the problem is how we think about the odds. Professor Zekethal found himself leaning forward, his skepticism warring with growing fascination. In 30 years of teaching tactical theory, he had never seen anything like this. Sarah Reyes was achieving results that violated fundamental principles of military mathematics. Alpha arrived with the enemy advance stalled completely. The overwhelming force that should have crushed the colony in the opening minutes was instead scattered across a battlefield where traditional advantages had become meaningless. Sarah's defenders controlled the tempo of battle, striking when and where they chose, disappearing before superior numbers could be brought to bear. This is impossible, Veltara breathed. The mathematical models clearly show. The mathematical models assume rational tactical behavior, Zekethal interrupted, his voice filled with growing wonder. They don't account for approaches that defy conventional wisdom. R5 saw the enemy commander's first tactical error, a mistake born of frustration with an opponent who refused to fight according to established rules, attempting to regain momentum. The enemy concentrated forces for a massive assault on what appeared to be Sarah's main defensive position. It was a trap. The position was lightly held, its apparent strength an illusion created through careful positioning and misdirection. When the enemy committed their reserves to the assault, Sarah's real forces struck from unexpected directions, catching the concentrated enemy in a crossfire that devastated their command structure. Brilliant, Zekethal whispered. She allowed the enemy's superior numbers to become a liability. Their own mass became a target. R6 marked the psychological breaking point. The enemy forces, faced with an opponent who seemed to anticipate their every move while presenting no targets for retaliation, began to lose cohesion. Unit commanders started second-guessing orders, afraid of walking into another impossible trap. The enemy morale is collapsing, reported Hicks Mara with amazement. A numerically superior force is losing confidence against a vastly inferior opponent because they expected to win easily, Sarah explained, her concentration never wavering from the tactical display. When easy victory turns into hard fighting, superior numbers don't matter as much as superior will. R7 brought the enemy's second critical error. Desperate to regain momentum, their commander divided his forces to attack multiple positions simultaneously. It was a tactically sound decision that should have overwhelmed Sarah's scattered defenders. Instead, it played directly into her strategy. Sarah's forces had never been scattered randomly. They had been positioned to concentrate rapidly against divided enemy forces. As the enemy split their overwhelming advantage into manageable segments, Sarah struck each segment with locally superior numbers, achieving tactical victories that accumulated into strategic success. She's defeating a superior force in detail, Zekethal observed with growing excitement. She's making them fight her battle instead of their own. R8 marked the point where mathematical impossibility became tactical reality. The enemy forces, despite maintaining numerical superiority, found themselves retreating from positions they should have overrun hours ago. Their advanced technology and orbital supremacy had been neutralized by an opponent who refused to present appropriate targets. R9 saw the collapse accelerate. Enemy units, expecting to face mass defenses they could overwhelm, instead encountered individual squads that struck without warning and vanished before retaliation. The psychological impact was devastating. A superior force was being outfought by an inferior opponent who seemed to understand them better than they understood themselves. This is unprecedented, breathed Veltara. The scenario is designed to be unwinnable. The mathematics prove it. The mathematics assume both sides fight the same kind of war, Sarah replied, her hands steady on the controls as she orchestrated a defense that redefined the possible. But what if one side fights a completely different war? R10 brought the enemy's final mistake, faced with inexplicable failure. Their commander attempted to restore order through overwhelming force. Every available unit was committed to a massive assault designed to crush the defenders. Through sheer weight of numbers, it was exactly what Sarah had been waiting for. Her forces, positioned throughout the operation to channel enemy movements into predetermined kill zones, struck the concentrated assault from every direction. The enemy's superior numbers, packed into confined spaces, became a liability as overlapping fields of fire created a slaughter. That broke the back of the invasion. Impossible, Six-Star whispered. She's actually winning. R12 saw the simulation's AI reach a state the programmers had never anticipated. Faced with tactical success that violated its programming parameters, the enemy forces began to withdraw, not through programmed retreat protocols, but through genuine recognition that continued assault would result in total defeat. The watching cadet sat in stunned silence as Sarah's forces achieved what every mathematical model said was impossible. A vastly outnumbered, poorly equipped defensive force was driving off an enemy that should have crushed them in the opening minutes. Computer, Zekethal commanded, his voice tight with disbelief, provide current tactical assessment. The data that appeared defied every assumption upon which the Academy's teaching was based. Enemy forces, 73% casualties, morale collapsed, command structure disrupted. Defending forces, 42% casualties, high morale. Tactical objectives achieved, victory probability, 87% and rising. R14 ended with complete enemy withdrawal. The simulation terminated not through defender defeat, the expected outcome programmed into every iteration, but through enemy recognition. That continued assault was futile. The tactical display faded, leaving the chamber in stunned silence. For the first time in the Academy's history, Operation Omega had been won. Computer, Zekethal's voice cracked slightly, confirmed simulation results. Operation Omega completed successfully. Defending forces achieved all tactical objectives. Enemy forces withdrew after sustaining unacceptable casualties. Simulation time, 14 hours, 27 minutes. Result, decisive defender victory. The silence that followed was profound. 24 of the galaxy's finest tactical minds sat motionless, their understanding of mathematical certainty shattered by a human who had achieved the impossible. Sarah stepped out of the command holosphere, her face showing the exhaustion of intense concentration, but also something else, a quiet satisfaction that came from proving what she had always believed. That impossible was just another word for something nobody had figured out yet. How? Zekethal's question carried the weight of a worldview in crisis. The mathematics clearly showed the scenario was unwinnable. How did you achieve victory? Sarah looked around the chamber at faces that showed confusion, wonder, and in some cases, I didn't fight the battle they expected me to fight, she replied simply. I fought the battle I could win, but the mathematical analysis assumed I would fight according to standard doctrine, assumed I would try to hold territory, mass, firepower, and trade casualties at unfavorable ratios. Sarah moved to the tactical display, calling up the replay of her defense. But what if I didn't try to win their battle? What if I made them fight mine? The replay showed her strategy in devastating clarity. From the opening moments, Sarah had never tried to fight a conventional defensive battle. Instead, she had turned the engagement into a psychological warfare campaign that used the enemy's expectations against them. You didn't try to stop them, Veltara realized. You made them stop themselves. I made them fight a war they weren't prepared for, Sarah corrected. They expected to overwhelm fixed defenses with superior firepower. When they couldn't find those defenses, their advantages became meaningless. But the casualties, the resource expenditure, the risk, Hicks Mara protested, were all acceptable because I wasn't trying to preserve forces, Sarah interrupted. I was trying to break their will to fight. Different objective, different tactics, different mathematics. Professor Zekethal stared at the tactical analysis, his academic certainty crumbling as he processed what he had witnessed. You're saying the scenario was only unwinnable if you accepted its assumptions about how the battle should be fought. I'm saying that mathematics can only predict the future if the future follows mathematical rules. Sarah replied, but people, human, alien, whatever, don't always follow mathematical rules. Sometimes they follow psychological ones. Sometimes they follow emotional ones. Sometimes they just follow the rules that give them the best chance to win. So the lesson of Operation Omega isn't that some battles can't be won, Veltara said slowly, understanding beginning to dawn in her voice. It's that some battles can't be won the way we expect to win them, maybe, Sarah agreed. Or maybe the lesson is that when someone tells you something is impossible, they're really telling you that they can't imagine how to make it possible. The chamber erupted into discussion as the implications of what they had witnessed began to sink in. Cadets, who had built their tactical understanding on mathematical certainty, found themselves questioning fundamental assumptions about warfare, strategy, and the nature of possibility itself. Professor Zekethal raised one of his forearms, calling for silence. When the chamber quieted, his voice carried a new note of respect. Captain Reyes, he said formally, you have achieved something that our mathematical models declared impossible. You have forced us to question assumptions that have guided galactic military doctrine for centuries. The question now is, what do we do with this knowledge? Sarah looked around the chamber at faces that had been skeptical, dismissive, even hostile. Now they showed something different, a willingness to learn from someone they had initially considered inferior. We learn, she said simply, we question our assumptions. We remember that mathematics can tell us what should happen, but it can't always tell us what will happen. And most importantly, we remember that impossible is not a fact, it's a challenge. The discussion that followed would continue for hours, then days, then weeks as the Galactic War Academy grappled with the implications of Sarah's victory. The mathematical certainty that had guided their teaching was not wrong, but it was incomplete. There were forms of warfare, approaches to impossible problems, that transcended purely mathematical analysis. As the cadets filed out of the chamber, their minds buzzing with new possibilities, Professor Zekethal approached Sarah. You've changed everything, he said quietly, not just this scenario, but our understanding of what's possible. The question is, are you prepared for the consequences? Sarah smiled, the expression carrying traces of the frontier worlds where she had learned that survival often required achieving the impossible. Professor, she replied, I've been preparing for consequences my entire life. The galaxy just needed to catch up. Outside the Academy walls, word was already spreading through galactic military circles about the human who had won the unwinnable battle. In fleet command centers and tactical planning rooms across the galaxy, officers were beginning to ask new questions about old assumptions. And on distant frontier worlds where humans still fought desperate battles against impossible odds, soldiers who had never heard of Operation Omega continued to do what they had always done, refused to accept defeat, even when mathematics demanded it. The impossible, it seemed, was only impossible until someone proved otherwise. The aftermath of Sarah's victory sent shockwaves through the Galactic War Academy that extended far beyond the confines of the tactical simulation chamber. Within hours, news of the unprecedented achievement had reached the highest levels of galactic military command, triggering debates that would reshape strategic thinking across multiple civilizations. Admiral Dex Mori of the Galactic Defense Coordinating Council stood in her private office aboard the command station, orbiting Proxima Centauri, staring at the detailed analysis of Operation Omega that had arrived via quantum transmission. The data was undeniable. A human cadet had achieved what the galaxy's finest tactical minds had declared mathematically impossible. This changes everything, she murmured to her aide, Commander Velsic of the Ethereal Collective. If the fundamental assumptions underlying our tactical doctrine are flawed, we need to reassess our entire approach to strategic planning. With respect, Admiral, Velsic replied, his translucent form flickering with concern. Isn't it possible that this was simply an anomaly? One successful attempt doesn't invalidate centuries of mathematical analysis. One successful attempt proves that our mathematical analysis was incomplete. Dex Mori corrected. The question isn't whether Captain Reyes got lucky. The question is what other impossible situations might be possible if we approach them differently. Back at the Academy, Professor Zekethal found himself at the center of an academic revolution. His classroom, once a temple to mathematical certainty, had become a laboratory for exploring the limits of conventional tactical wisdom. The questions raised by Sarah's victory had forced a fundamental re-examination of everything the institution taught. The problem, he explained to a packed auditorium of faculty and senior cadets, is that we've been treating mathematical probability as absolute. truth rather than analytical tool. Captain Reyes didn't violate the laws of mathematics. She demonstrated that mathematics based on incomplete assumptions produces incomplete conclusions. In the front row, Sarah sat quietly as the Academy's greatest tactical minds grappled with the implications of her success. The attention was both gratifying and overwhelming. She had come to the Academy to learn, not to revolutionize galactic military thinking. The key insight, Thekethal continued, is that Captain Reyes changed the fundamental nature of the engagement. Instead of fighting a defensive battle against superior numbers, she fought a psychological campaign that turned the enemy's advantages into disadvantages. Cadet Veltara raised one of her appendages. Professor, if human tactical thinking can achieve results that our mathematical models don't predict, how do we incorporate that unpredictability into our strategic planning? That, Thekethal replied, is exactly the question we need to answer. The weeks that followed saw unprecedented changes at the Academy. New courses were introduced focusing on non-mathematical tactical analysis and psychological warfare applications. Guest lecturers were brought in from human military academies to share their approaches to impossible problems. Most significantly, the Academy's tactical scenarios were redesigned to encourage creative thinking rather than mathematical optimization. Sarah found herself thrust into an unexpected role as instructor, working with alien cadets who struggled to understand human approaches to tactical problems. The cultural barriers were significant. Species that had, in one scenario, alien cadets learned to defeat numerically superior forces by making those forces afraid to use their numerical advantage in another. They discovered how to turn advanced technology into a liability by forcing enemies to depend on systems that could be psychologically rather than physically disrupted. It's remarkable, observed Commander Kexanara, a visiting instructor from the Techno Confederacy. These human approaches to warfare don't just challenge our tactical doctrine, they challenge our understanding of logic itself. They challenge our understanding of complete logic, Thekethal corrected. We've been using mathematical logic while ignoring psychological logic. Captain Reyes has shown us that both are necessary for truly effective tactical thinking. The philosophical implications extended far beyond military applications. Universities across the galaxy began questioning their approaches to problem-solving in fields ranging from engineering to diplomacy. The concept that impossible might simply mean requiring a different approach sparked innovation in multiple disciplines. We've been trapped by our own sophistication, observed Dr. Veltara of the Galactic Institute of Advanced Sciences. During a cross-disciplinary conference on human problem-solving methods, we've become so focused on mathematical elegance that we've forgotten that elegance and effectiveness aren't always the same thing. Sarah, invited as a keynote speaker despite her relatively junior rank, addressed an audience of the galaxy's leading academics and military officers. The real lesson of Operation Omega isn't that humans are better at tactics than aliens, she began. It's that different perspectives lead to different solutions. When you have a problem that seems impossible, maybe the issue isn't the problem. Maybe it's the perspective you're using to approach it. She paused, looking out at an audience that included beings whose civilizations had been solving complex problems for millennia longer than humanity had existed. We humans aren't smarter than you. We're not more logical or more strategic, but we're different. We approach problems from angles that your mathematical models don't account for, and sometimes that difference is exactly what's needed to turn an impossible problem into a solvable one. The applause that followed was respectful, but thoughtful. The galaxy's intellectual elite were grappling with the humbling realization that their sophisticated approaches to problem solving had blind spots that could be addressed by embracing what they had previously considered primitive thinking. The military applications of these insights began appearing in real-world conflicts within months. The first major test came during the border skirmish between the crystalline hegemony and the Void Hunters, where hegemony forces found themselves facing an enemy that employed human-trained tactical advisors. The results were spectacular. Hegemony forces, expecting to face conventional tactics from a technologically inferior opponent, instead found themselves fighting an enemy that refused to behave according to mathematical predictions. Void Hunter units, trained in human psychological warfare techniques, turned the hegemony's advanced technology into a liability by making them afraid to use it effectively. It's unprecedented, reported Admiral Klexanara from the Hegemony Fleet Command. We have overwhelming technological advantages, but the enemy is winning through approaches that our tactical computers can't model. The conflict ended not through military defeat, but through negotiated settlement, as both sides recognized that traditional approaches to interstellar warfare had been fundamentally changed by human tactical innovation. This is the future of galactic military doctrine, observed Admiral Lex Morey during a strategic planning session. Not just human approaches or alien approaches, but integrated approaches that combine mathematical analysis with psychological insight. The transformation was not without resistance. Traditional military academies across the galaxy struggled to adapt curricula that had been refined over centuries. Many senior officers found it difficult to abandon tactical philosophies that had defined their careers. We're being asked to throw away everything we know about warfare, complained General Zextara of the Stratocracy Defense Force. These human methods may work in simulations, but real combat requires mathematical precision and logical analysis. Real combat requires whatever works, replied Admiral Velnox, who had become one of the leading advocates for integrated tactical doctrine. If mathematical precision and logical analysis were sufficient, we would never lose battles against inferior forces. The fact that we sometimes do suggest our approach is incomplete. The debate reached its climax during the Galactic Military Convention, where representatives from every major defense force gathered to establish new standards for tactical education and strategic planning. Sarah, now promoted to major and serving as Earth's representative to the convention, found herself at the center of discussions that would shape military doctrine for generations. The question before us, addressed Supreme Commander Thexalon of the Galactic Defense Council, is whether we're prepared to abandon the certainty of mathematical analysis for the uncertainty of psychological warfare. That's a false choice, Sarah replied during her presentation to the assembled commanders. We're not abandoning mathematical analysis, we're supplementing it with psychological analysis. We're not choosing uncertainty over certainty, we're choosing complete analysis over incomplete analysis. She activated a holographic display showing comparative results from recent military exercises. Forces trained in integrated tactical doctrine consistently outperform forces using purely mathematical approaches, not because mathematics is wrong, but because mathematics alone isn't sufficient. You need both logical analysis and psychological insight to achieve optimal results. The evidence was overwhelming in simulation after simulation. Forces that combine mathematical precision with psychological warfare achieved results that purely logical approaches could not match. More importantly, they achieved these results while suffering fewer casualties and requiring fewer resources. The integration of human tactical thinking doesn't make our forces less professional, observed Commander Velsira of the Techno-Confederacy. It makes them more complete. We're not abandoning our strengths, we're addressing our weaknesses. The convention concluded with the adoption of the Comprehensive Tactical Doctrine, a revolutionary approach to military education that required all officers to train in both mathematical and psychological approaches to warfare. The doctrine didn't replace traditional tactical education. It enhanced it with perspectives that had previously been ignored. This represents the most significant evolution in galactic military thinking in over 1,000 years, Zekathal observed as he reviewed the new training requirements. We're not just learning new tactics, we're learning new ways to think about tactics. Sarah, reflecting on the transformation that had begun with her attempt at an impossible scenario, felt a mixture of pride and responsibility. The galaxy's military forces were becoming more effective, but they were also becoming more complex. The certainty of mathematical analysis was being replaced by the nuanced understanding that effective tactics required both logical and psychological components. The real victory wasn't Operation Omega, she realized during a quiet moment in her academy quarters. The real victory was getting the galaxy to question its assumptions about what's possible. Outside her window, the lights of the academy glittered against the backdrop of space. Somewhere among those lights, today we will study the Battle of Kepler Station, he announced to the assembled students, his voice carrying the enthusiasm of intellectual revolution. This engagement demonstrates the integration of mathematical precision with psychological warfare, logical analysis with intuitive adaptation. In the front row, Cadet Veltara, now a senior student specializing in hybrid tactical approaches, leaned forward with interest. Beside her sat Cadet Thompson, one of the first human students to arrive as part of the expanded exchange program. The diversity of the class reflected the Academy's new commitment to multiple perspectives on tactical problems. The defending force was numerically inferior and technologically disadvantaged. Zekathal continued. Mathematical analysis suggested a probability of victory at approximately 15%. However, the human commander, trained in integrated tactical doctrine, achieved victory through approaches that purely mathematical models could not predict. Cadet Thompson raised his hand. Professor, how do we quantify psychological factors? In our tactical planning, human instincts aren't easily reduced to mathematical formulas. An excellent question, Zekathal replied. We don't quantify psychological factors. We account for them. We recognize that mathematics can tell us what should happen, but psychology tells us what will happen when real beings face real choices under real pressure. The discussion that followed would have been impossible before Sarah's victory. Alien students debated the merits of intuitive versus analytical approaches to tactical problems. Human students learned to integrate their instinctive understanding of conflict psychology with the mathematical precision that galactic warfare demanded. The key insight, explained Cadet Veltara during the class discussion, is that mathematical models assume rational behavior from all participants. But real combat involves beings who make decisions based on fear, anger, hope, and desperation. When you account for those psychological factors, new tactical possibilities emerge. Exactly. Zekathal confirmed. Captain Reyes, now Major Reyes, didn't violate mathematical principles. She demonstrated that complete tactical analysis requires both mathematical and psychological components. Across the galaxy, similar discussions were taking place in military academies, fleet command centers, and strategic planning facilities. The integration of human tactical thinking had created a renaissance in military innovation, leading to approaches that neither purely logical nor purely intuitive methods could achieve alone. Admiral Lex Mori, now serving as head of the Galactic Defense Council's Strategic Innovation Division, reviewed reports from conflicts across multiple sectors. The results were consistently impressive. Forces trained in integrated tactical doctrine were achieving victory ratios that exceeded all historical precedents. The improvement isn't just in win-loss records, she observed to her staff during a quarterly review. It's in resource efficiency, casualty reduction, and conflict resolution. When you fight smarter rather than just harder, everyone benefits. The real test of the new doctrine came during the Andromedan crisis, when a hostile force from outside the galaxy launched an invasion that threatened every known civilization. The attackers used technology and tactics that were completely unknown, making traditional mathematical analysis impossible. Major Sarah Reyes, now serving as the Galactic Defense Council's Chief of Tactical Innovation, found herself facing the ultimate challenge, a truly unknown enemy that couldn't be defeated through either pure logic or pure intuition alone. We're fighting an enemy we don't understand using technology we can't analyze, she reported to the Emergency Command Council. Our mathematical models are useless because we don't have baseline data. Our psychological profiles are meaningless because we don't understand their motivations. So how do we fight them? Demanded General Kexanara of the Crystalline Hegemony. We do what humans have always done when facing the unknown, Sarah replied. We adapt. We experiment. We try things that shouldn't work until we find something that does work. The campaign that followed became known as the Impossible War, a conflict where every battle required inventing new approaches to problems that had never been encountered before. Human tactical flexibility combined with alien mathematical precision created solutions that neither species could have developed independently. We're not just fighting an enemy, observed Commander Velsic during one of the many strategy sessions. We're inventing entirely new forms of warfare. Every engagement teaches us something new about what's possible. The turning point came during the Battle of the Void Gates, where Sarah implemented a strategy that combined human psychological warfare with alien technological innovation. Instead of trying to defeat the enemy through superior force, she created conditions that made the enemy defeat themselves. We made them afraid of their own advantages, she explained to the post-battle analysis team. Their technology was superior, but we convinced them that using it was too dangerous. Their numbers were overwhelming, but we made them doubt whether those numbers could be trusted. The victory was decisive, but more importantly, it demonstrated that the integration of human and alien approaches to warfare had created something genuinely new, a form of tactical thinking that was greater than the sum of its parts. We've achieved something unprecedented, observed Professor Zekethal during a lecture at the Academy. We've created a truly universal approach to tactical problems, one that works regardless of the specific nature of the enemy or the circumstances of the engagement. The post-war analysis showed results that exceeded even the most optimistic projections. Casualty rates had dropped by 60% compared to historical averages. Resource expenditure had been reduced by 40%. Most importantly, conflicts were being resolved faster and more decisively than ever before. The integration of human tactical thinking hasn't just made us more effective, reported Admiral Lex Mori to the Galactic Council. It's made us more humane. When you fight smarter, you don't need to fight as brutally. The philosophical implications of this transformation extended far beyond military applications. Universities across the galaxy began incorporating human problem-solving methods into their curricula. Engineering schools taught intuitive innovation alongside mathematical design. Diplomatic academies studied human approaches to conflict, resolution, and negotiation. The humans had given us something more valuable than new tactical doctrines, observed Dr. Velkara of the Institute for Advanced Theoretical Sciences. They've given us permission to question our assumptions about the nature of problem-solving itself. 5 years after Sarah's victory in Operation Omega, she stood once again in the Academy's tactical simulation chamber, this time as an instructor rather than a student. The chamber had been redesigned to accommodate the new integrated approach to tactical education. Mathematical models worked alongside psychological assessments. Probability calculations shared space with intuitive analysis. Today we'll be studying a new scenario, she announced to her class of mixed human and alien cadets. Unlike Operation Omega, this scenario hasn't been declared unwinnable. Instead, it's been designed to have no predetermined solution. Your task is to find an approach that works, regardless of whether that approach follows traditional tactical doctrine. The challenge that appeared in the holographic display was unlike anything the Academy had previously attempted. It wasn't a specific military engagement, but rather a complex problem-solving exercise that required both analytical precision and creative innovation. The key to success, Sarah continued, isn't following established procedures or calculating optimal solutions. It's understanding that every problem contains the seeds of its own solution. You just have to be willing to look for them in places where others might not think to search. As her students began to analyze the scenario, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought them to this point. The galaxy's military forces had been transformed not by abandoning their analytical strengths, but by embracing approaches that complemented those strengths with new perspectives on what was possible. Professor, asked Cadet Hicks Mara, one of her most promising students, what do you do when you encounter a problem that seems to have no solution at all? Sarah smiled, remembering her own confusion when first confronted with Operation Omega. You remember that no solution usually means no solution using the approaches we've tried so far, she replied, and then you start looking for approaches that haven't been tried yet. The lesson continued, but Sarah's mind wandered to the broader implications of what had been achieved. The galaxy had learned that impossible was not a fact, but a challenge, that mathematical certainty was a tool rather than a truth, and that the most important tactical skill was not knowing how to solve known problems, but knowing how to approach unknown ones. In simulation chambers across the galaxy, a new generation of officers was learning these lessons. They were becoming tacticians who could think both logically and intuitively, strategists who could plan both mathematically and psychologically, commanders who could lead both through analysis and through inspiration. The transformation was complete, but it was also ongoing. Each new challenge, each unprecedented problem, each impossible scenario became an opportunity to discover new ways of turning the impossible into the merely difficult and the difficult into the achievable. The real lesson of Operation Omega, Sarah realized as she watched her students grapple with their own impossible scenarios, wasn't that humans could win unwinnable battles. It was that unwinnable battles don't exist. Only battles that haven't been won yet by people who are willing to try approaches that no one else has considered. The mathematical model still said that many things should be impossible. They were still right, within the limits of their assumptions. But the galaxy had learned that assumptions could be questioned, models could be expanded, And impossible was just another word for something that required a different kind of possible. And sometimes, the most important victory wasn't achieving the impossible. Sometimes, the most important victory was teaching others that impossible wasn't permanent. It was just a starting point for discovering what was actually possible. When you were willing to think differently about the nature of possibility itself. In the end, Sarah's greatest achievement wasn't winning an unwinnable battle. It was teaching the galaxy that there was no such thing as an unwinnable battle. Only battles that required new ways of thinking about what it meant to win. The chamber filled with the excited voices of students discovering new approaches to impossible problems. And Sarah smiled. The lesson was being learned, passed on, and expanded with each new generation of tacticians who understood that the most important question wasn't whether something was possible. The most important question was whether they were creative enough to figure out how to make it possible. And in a galaxy that had learned to question its assumptions about the nature of the impossible, that question was always answered the same way. Let's find out. 10 years after the Battle of Operation Omega, the Galactic War Academy had become something unprecedented in military history. An institution that taught not just tactical doctrine, but tactical innovation. The marble halls that had once echoed with the certainty of mathematical analysis now hummed with the dynamic energy of constant discovery. Sarah Reyes, now Colonel and Director of Advanced Tactical Studies, stood before the Academy's Board of Governors as they reviewed the institution's transformation. Representatives from every major civilization in the galaxy sat around the crystalline conference table, their faces reflecting a mixture of pride and amazement at what had been accomplished. The results speak for themselves, reported Admiral Dex Mori, presenting the decade's statistical analysis. Academy graduates trained in integrated tactical doctrine have achieved a 93% mission success rate across all conflict types. More significantly, they've reduced average casualty rates by 72% while increasing resource efficiency by 64%. Board Chairman Velthok of the Eternal Confederacy leaned forward, his ancient features showing the wisdom of someone who had witnessed galactic military evolution for centuries. These improvements extend beyond mere tactical effectiveness. Our graduates are reporting higher satisfaction rates, better unit cohesion, and more successful post-conflict resolutions. Because they're not just learning how to fight, Sarah explained. They're learning how to think about fighting. When you understand that every tactical problem contains multiple solutions, you can choose the solution that achieves your objectives with minimum cost and maximum efficiency. The transformation had indeed been remarkable. The Academy's approach to tactical education had been adopted by military institutions across the galaxy, creating a new generation of officers who combine analytical precision with creative innovation. The rigid certainty of mathematical warfare had given way to the flexible adaptability of truly comprehensive tactical thinking. The most significant change, observed Professor Zekethal, now the Academy's Dean of Integrated Studies, is in how our students approach unknown problems. Previously, cadets would analyze scenarios until they found the mathematically optimal solution. Now they analyze scenarios until they understand the nature of the problem, then create solutions tailored to that specific situation. This shift in approach had produced results that exceeded all projections. Recent conflicts had been resolved more quickly and decisively than historical precedents suggested was possible. More importantly, they had been resolved in ways that preserved rather than destroyed the infrastructure and relationships necessary for lasting peace. The Centauri Rebellion, which military analysts had predicted would require years of destructive warfare, had been resolved in 6 months through an approach that combined military pressure with psychology, insight. Instead of simply overwhelming the rebels with superior force, the integrated tactical approach had addressed the underlying motivations for rebellion. While demonstrating the futility of continued resistance, we didn't just defeat the rebellion, reported General Kexanara, who had commanded the operation. We converted it into a negotiation. By understanding what the rebels actually wanted, as opposed to what they said they wanted, we were able to create conditions where surrender became more attractive than continued fighting. Similar successes had been achieved in conflicts across the galaxy. The Void Hunter incursions had been stopped not through massive military campaigns, but through tactical approaches that made raiding unprofitable. The crystalline hegemonies, border disputes, had been resolved through strategies that gave all parties more than they could achieve through warfare. The key insight, Sarah explained to a visiting delegation of military analysts, is that most conflicts can be resolved in multiple ways. Traditional approaches focus on finding the way that demonstrates military superiority. Integrated approaches focus on finding the way that achieves lasting resolution with minimum cost to all parties. This philosophy had begun to influence areas far beyond military tactics. Diplomatic academies were teaching negotiation strategies based on integrated tactical principles. Economic planning institutions were applying tactical innovation methods to resource allocation problems. Even civilian emergency services were using tactical adaptation approaches to handle unprecedented crisis situations. We've created more than a new form of military education, observed Dr. Velsara of the Galactic Institute for Social Innovation. We've created a new way of thinking about complex problems in general. The principles that make tactical innovation possible apply equally to any situation where traditional approaches are insufficient. The practical applications were impressive, but the philosophical implications were even more significant. The galaxy's academic institutions were grappling with the realization that their sophisticated analytical methods, while powerful, were incomplete without the creative flexibility that humans brought to problem solving. For millennia, we've equated intelligence with analytical precision, reflected Professor Kex Thorin of the Universal Academy of Sciences. The humans have shown us that true intelligence includes the ability to think beyond the boundaries of analysis itself. This recognition had sparked a renaissance in scientific innovation. Research teams that combine alien analytical capabilities with human creative approaches were making discoveries that neither could achieve independently. Engineering projects that had been stalled for decades were being completed using hybrid methodologies that combine mathematical optimization with intuitive innovation. The medical applications were particularly striking. Diseases that had resisted traditional treatment approaches were being cured through methods that combine. Change is always difficult, Sarah acknowledged during a conference on educational innovation. But the alternative to change is stagnation. The galaxy faces new challenges every generation. We can either adapt our approaches to meet those challenges, or we can maintain our current approaches and hope that new challenges will somehow conform to old solutions. The evidence favoring adaptation was overwhelming. Institutions that had embraced integrated approaches were consistently outperforming those that maintained traditional methods. Students trained in hybrid methodologies were achieving results that exceeded all historical precedents. Most tellingly, they were enjoying their education and careers more than previous generations had. We're not just creating more effective professionals, observed educational researcher Dr. Zixkara. We're creating more satisfied individuals. When people understand that their problems have solutions, even if those solutions require creative thinking, they approach their work with greater enthusiasm and confidence. The long-term implications were staggering. A generation of galactic citizens was growing up with the understanding that impossible was a temporary condition rather than a permanent limitation. They were learning to approach challenges with the assumption that solutions existed, even if those solutions required unprecedented approaches. We're witnessing the emergence of a new galactic culture, predicted social analyst Veltaran during a symposium on cultural evolution, one that values innovation over tradition, adaptation over rigidity, and creative problem-solving over adherence to established procedures. This cultural shift was already having measurable effects. Crime rates were declining as law enforcement agencies applied integrated approaches to preventing rather than just punishing criminal behavior. Economic instability was decreasing as financial institutions learned to anticipate and adapt to changing conditions rather than simply reacting to them. Even interpersonal relationships were improving as individuals learned to apply tactical innovation principles to resolving conflicts and building cooperation. The humans haven't just changed how we fight wars, reflected philosophy Professor Kex Marin of the Academy of Advanced Thought. They've changed how we think about the nature of problems and solutions themselves. Standing before the Academy's Board of Governors, Sarah felt the weight of what had been accomplished and the responsibility of what still needed to be done. The galaxy had learned to question its assumptions about the impossible, but that was only the beginning of a much larger transformation. The real work isn't behind us, she told the assembled governors. It's ahead of us. Every new challenge, every unprecedented problem, every situation that seems impossible is an opportunity to discover new forms of the possible. Our job isn't to rest on what we've achieved. It's to keep pushing the boundaries of what can be achieved. The board voted unanimously to expand the Academy's programs, establishing satellite campuses throughout the galaxy and creating new curricula that would integrate tactical innovation principles into every field of study. The impossible had become possible, but possibility itself was expanding to encompass challenges that had never been imagined. As the meeting concluded and the governors returned to their respective worlds, Sarah remained in the conference room, looking out at the stars that had once seemed to represent insurmountable distances and impossible challenges. Now they looked like opportunities, destinations waiting to be reached by people who understood that impossible was just another word for something that required a different approach to possibility. The galaxy had learned the most important lesson that humans could teach, that the only thing that was truly impossible was accepting impossible as final. Everything else was just a matter of figuring out how to make it possible. And in a universe where that lesson had been learned, anything could happen. Usually did. As Sarah stood alone in the conference room, her reflection caught in the crystalline surface of the meeting table. She thought about the young cadet who had walked into Operation Omega 10 years ago, with nothing but stubborn determination and a refusal to accept mathematical certainty as absolute truth. That cadet had been convinced that impossible was just another word for something nobody had figured out yet. She had been right, but she had also been incomplete, because impossible wasn't just something nobody had figured out yet. Impossible was something nobody had figured out yet, using the approaches they were willing to consider. And the most important part of making the impossible possible wasn't finding new solutions. It was being willing to question old assumptions about what solutions could look like. The galaxy had learned that lesson, and it had changed everything. But Sarah suspected that the most important changes were still ahead of them, waiting to be discovered by people who understood that the only limit to what was possible was the limit of their willingness to imagine new forms of possibility. Outside the conference room windows, the stars wheeled in their eternal dance, indifferent to the struggles and triumphs of the beings who dwelt among them. But those beings had learned something that even the stars couldn't teach. That impossible was not a destination. It was a starting point, and every ending was just a new beginning waiting to be discovered by someone willing to believe that the impossible was simply the possible in disguise. The Academy would continue its work, the students would continue learning, and the galaxy would continue discovering new ways to turn the impossible into the inevitable. Because that, in the end, was what it meant to be truly alive in a universe where anything was possible. For those who refused to accept that anything was impossible, they had declared the battle unwinnable. They had been right within the limits of their assumptions, but assumptions, like battles, were only unwinnable until someone figured out how to win them. And in a galaxy that had learned that lesson, there were no unwinnable battles, only battles that hadn't been won yet.